The first snow had come early that year. Outside the small wooden cabin on the edge of Stowe, Vermont, the world had turned white and silent. Snowflakes drifted past the window like tiny feathers, landing softly on the bird feeder Grace had built out of scraps of cedar. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine resin and coffee. Grace stood by the window, her wool sweater frayed at the cuffs, watching a handful of sparrows fight for crumbs of bread she had left before dawn. Their tiny wings beat against the glass, leaving ghostly marks that faded almost as quickly as they appeared. She smiled faintly. "Easy now," she whispered, tapping the window lightly. "There's enough for everyone." Her voice was soft, almost a secret shared with the snow itself. In moments like these, when the world outside seemed paused between heartbeats, Grace felt both safe and terribly alone. The warmth of the fire behind her didn't quite reach the hollow place in her chest, a place carved out by years of struggle and loss. She had learned to live quietly, to find comfort in simple things, a kettle whistling, the rustle of dry logs, the heartbeat of winter pressing gently against the glass. Her gaze drifted to the small wooden table by the stove, where an old tin plate rested. A few crumbs of sugar glimmered there, and suddenly her mind was pulled backward, years ago, to a kitchen smaller and colder than this one. She could still see the faces of her brother Noah and little sister Sophie, huddled near the stove while she mixed stale bread with melted sugar and a bit of margarine. "Our special cake," she'd called it, trying to make them laugh. They had clapped their hands and believed her, the way only children could believe in sweetness born from nothing. The memory ached like an old wound, but warmed her, too, like the first sip of cocoa after a storm. Grace blinked, her breath fogging the glass. A red cardinal landed on the feeder, bold and bright against the white world. It looked straight at her, unafraid, as if recognizing something in her, a quiet persistence, a refusal to vanish despite the cold. She placed her palm against the glass, feeling the faint pulse of life on the other side. "You made it," she murmured. The fire crackled softly behind her. Outside, the snow deepened, covering the traces of yesterday. Inside, Grace Miller stood alone yet steady, surrounded by silence that felt less like emptiness and more like peace. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't running from anything. She was simply here. The sound of the wind outside brought back a memory, one Grace had spent years trying to forget. She was 15 again, standing barefoot in the kitchen of a narrow apartment on the edge of Burlington. The linoleum was sticky with spilled beer. A half-empty bottle rolled across the floor each time the furnace kicked in. Her mother lay passed out on the couch, lipstick smeared, one arm dangling toward the carpet. The television hummed with late-night infomercials no one watched. Grace remembered the smell, cheap vodka, and burnt toast, and how it clung to her hair no matter how many times she washed it. That year, her mother had started bringing men home more often. Some stayed for a night, others for a week. Grace had learned to lock her door, to pull Noah and Sophie into her bed when the shouting started. She'd whisper stories to drown out the noise, a princess made of glass, a kingdom where it never rained, anything to keep them from crying. The next morning, she'd pack their lunches, braid Sophie's hair, and send them to school, pretending everything was fine. It was a performance she grew too good at. Their neighbor, Martha Ellis, was the only adult who noticed. A stout woman with gray curls and sharp eyes. She'd knock on the door whenever the smell of smoke or fighting grew too strong. "You kids eatin'?" she'd ask, handing Grace a pot of stew. Martha never asked too many questions, but Grace saw the pity in her eyes. Sometimes pity was worse than cruelty. It reminded you what normal looked like. The night everything collapsed, the air had been heavy with rain. Grace had come home from the store to find 2 police cars parked outside. Red and blue lights pulsed across the peeling walls. Martha stood on the porch, her face pale. Inside, paramedics were kneeling beside the couch. Her mother wasn't moving. The sound of the zipper from the body bag would haunt Grace for years. It was too final, too casual. A woman in a navy windbreaker. The one who called herself a social worker tried to sound gentle. "You're very brave, Grace, but you can't stay here anymore." Grace didn't understand at first. "I'll take care of them," she said, clutching Noah's small hand, Sophie crying against her shoulder. "I always take care of them." But the woman just shook her head. "You're 15. You can't." The words sliced through her like glass. She screamed until her throat burned, begged, swore she could cook, clean, do anything, just don't separate us. But bureaucracy doesn't understand love. Within hours, Noah and Sophie were taken away in separate cars. Grace remembered the sound of Sophie's tiny voice calling her name from the back seat until it disappeared into the rain. When the apartment fell silent, Grace stood in the doorway with her mother's old coat around her shoulders. Martha tried to hold her, but Grace couldn't feel anything. Not grief, not rage, just an empty numbness spreading through her chest. That night, she learned what it meant to be stripped of something you can never earn back. Not childhood, not family, but the right to protect the ones you love. The day they took her siblings away was gray and wet. The kind of day when everything felt blurred at the edges. Grace stood at the edge of the parking lot outside the state welfare office, her shoes soaked through, her fingers locked around the straps of a plastic bag holding a few of Sophie's clothes. Across the lot, 2 separate cars idled, one for Noah, one for Sophie. The social workers spoke in quiet, practiced voices, like this was just another routine. Grace wanted to scream that it wasn't routine, that these weren't just placements. They were her family. Sophie was the first to go. The little girl clung to her like a kitten, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Grace bent down, pressing her face into Sophie's hair, inhaling the faint scent of apples and soap. "I'll find you," she whispered. "No matter where they take you, I'll find you, okay?" But Sophie didn't answer. Her words drowned under the rain and the sound of the car door closing. Noah tried to look brave, but the tremor in his chin gave him away. He reached out, his palm cold against Grace's. "You have to promise," he said. "Promise you'll come." Grace nodded, unable to speak. Then his car pulled away, and all that was left was silence and the reflection of taillights on wet asphalt. The next weeks blurred together in fragments. New rooms, new faces, new rules. Her first foster home smelled of bleach and fried food. The woman who ran it cared more about order than children. "Chores are posted on the fridge," she said without looking up. The other kids were older, harder. They laughed at Grace's quietness, her hand-me-down clothes, the way she saved every penny she earned from after-school, cleaning jobs. Someone once cut the strings off her backpack just to watch her cry. She didn't give them the satisfaction. At night, she'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the sound of Noah's voice or Sophie's laugh. Sometimes she'd dream of them, running through tall grass under a summer sky, calling for her. She'd wake up reaching into the dark, the ache in her chest almost physical. The next morning, she'd rise before everyone else, make her bed, and go to school as if nothing hurt. That was the only way to survive. Keep moving, keep quiet, keep breathing. When she turned 18, the system simply released her. No ceremony, no goodbyes, just a manila envelope with her documents, 2 worn photographs, and a prepaid card with a few $100. Standing on the steps of the county office, she looked up at the sky. The snow was falling again, just like it had that day years ago. She slipped the photos into her coat pocket and whispered to herself, "Now it's my turn." With nothing but the bag on her shoulder and the fire of determination in her chest, Grace Miller walked away from the system that had broken her, and toward the life she would have to build from nothing. The road to Burlington stretched like a silver ribbon through the snow. Grace sat near the back of the Greyhound bus, her backpack wedged between her knees, watching the frost creep across the window pane. Each town they passed looked smaller than the last. White steeples, shuttered diners, old gas stations half buried in snowdrifts. Somewhere along that quiet journey, she remembered something Martha Ellis had once told her years ago, back when she was still a frightened girl with 2 little siblings and a mother who rarely came home. "There's an old cabin near the birch woods, past the county line," Martha had said, stirring sugar into her tea. "Belonged to my friend Hazel. She passed last winter. Poor soul. Nobody's claimed it yet. It's not much, but it's dry and quiet. If you ever need to disappear, Grace, that place will wait for you." At the time, Grace hadn't thought much of it, but now, sitting alone with nowhere else to go, the memory surfaced like a lantern in fog. When the bus rolled into Burlington, she stepped off without a plan, the wind biting through her coat. She found a small diner open near the station, ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a cup of black coffee, and asked the waitress how far the birchwoods were. The woman looked at her like she was half crazy. "About 6 miles out. Not much there, but trees and ghosts." Grace smiled faintly. "Ghosts don't scare me." By dusk, she was walking along a snowpack trail, her boots sinking deep into the drifts. The forest was silent except for the crunch of ice beneath her feet. When she finally saw it, a small cottage tucked between 2 birch trees, it looked almost unreal, as if the forest had been guarding it for her all along. The shutters hung crooked, the porch sagged, and snow had piled up to the windowsills. Still, something about it felt alive, like it had been waiting. She tried the door, half expecting it to be locked. It didn't budge. Then she remembered Martha's words. Under the mat. Kneeling, she brushed away the snow and felt the cold metal of a key. Her breath caught. The lock turned with a tired click, and the door swung inward, releasing a breath of cold air and dust. Inside, everything was still. A table covered in a thin layer of frost, a few broken dishes, an old rocking chair facing the window. Grace stood there for a long moment, her breath visible in the air, then whispered, "Home." Over the next few days, she swept the floors, patched the leaks, and dragged an old mattress from the attic. She found a small grocery store in town that needed help stocking shelves. The pay was meager, but it was enough for food, candles, and firewood. Each night, she'd sit by the window with a mug of instant coffee, listening to the wind hum through the birch trees. The cottage was crumbling, the work endless, but it was hers. For the first time in years, Grace wasn't surviving under someone else's rules. She was building something of her own. The storm rolled in without warning. By nightfall, the wind howled through the birch trees like a living thing, shaking the windows of the cottage. Grace had just finished mending a tear in her coat when she heard it, a faint sound from outside. At first she thought it was a branch hitting the porch, but then came a dull, rhythmic thud, like metal scraping against ice. She hesitated, wrapped her scarf tight, and stepped into the cold. Snow whipped at her face, blurring the world into white. The only light came from the flickering lantern she carried, and for a moment she thought she might have imagined it. Then she saw it, an old sedan half buried in the drift near the birch line, its headlights dimmed to a dying glow. She pushed through the snow until she reached the driver's door, and what she found inside made her blood run cold. An elderly man sat slumped over the wheel, his skin gray, breath shallow. The window was cracked open, snow drifting inside. "Sir." Grace shouted over the wind. No response. She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking, and called 911. "There's a man out here. He's freezing, not moving. Please hurry." The dispatcher's calm voice gave her instructions. "Keep him warm. Stay with him." She threw open the door, dragging the man's heavy body into her arms. He was still alive, barely. By the time the ambulance arrived, Grace was numb to the cold. The paramedics worked quickly, their voices brisk and professional. "Name's Thomas Hale," one said, glancing at the ID in the man's wallet. "Local businessman. Guessing a heart issue. He's lucky you found him." Grace followed them to the small county hospital, her mind still spinning. Hours later, she sat in the fluorescent hallway outside his room, wrapped in a hospital blanket. Through the glass, she could see him lying still under a tangle of wires. When a nurse came by, Grace asked quietly, "Does he have anyone?" The nurse shook her head. "He's been here before. No visitors. No family listed." The next morning, Thomas woke. His voice was weak but steady. "You're the girl from the woods," he rasped. Grace smiled faintly. "You gave me quite a scare." He studied her face for a long time before saying, "Don't leave." It wasn't a command, more a plea from someone who hadn't asked anything of anyone in years. She visited every day after work, bringing soup or a book from the thrift store. He was stubborn and proud, but there was a sharp mind behind his weary eyes. Slowly, he began to talk about the business he'd lost, the wife who'd left when his health failed, the son he never got to know. Grace didn't pry. She simply listened. Sometimes that was enough. When he was discharged 2 weeks later, he refused the rehab facility the doctor suggested. "Take me to your cabin," he said. "If I'm going to die, I'd rather do it somewhere quiet." Against her better judgment, Grace agreed. She cleared a space near the fire and moved an old armchair beside the window. Days turned into weeks. She worked mornings at the store, spent afternoons cooking and reading aloud to him. He'd grumble at her stubbornness. She'd tease him for his impatience. Somewhere between the silence and the snow, something wordless grew between them, a fragile thread of trust binding two people who had nothing left, yet somehow found each other in the middle of a storm. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that made time feel suspended. Outside, winter deepened, snow stacked high on the roof. Icicles hung like glass daggers from the eaves. But inside the cabin, the air was warm, scented with wood smoke and soup. Grace woke before sunrise, stoked the fire, and filled the kettle. By the time Thomas stirred, she'd already prepared breakfast, oatmeal with cinnamon, tea strong enough to fight the cold. He'd sit by the window, wrapped in the old wool blanket she'd found in the attic, watching the birch trees sway. "You treat me like I'm someone important," he once said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. Grace smiled. "You are." In the evenings, she read to him, books she borrowed from the library in town. Hemingway, Steinbeck, sometimes poetry when the nights felt particularly long. His favorite was Frost. He'd close his eyes and listen as she read, stopping by woods on a snowy evening, his breathing matching the rhythm of her voice. When she finished, he'd murmur. He knew what loneliness was. The man who wrote that. Little by little, Thomas began to talk, not in long confessions, but in fragments that fit together like pieces of a puzzle. He told her about the son he'd lost years ago in a car accident, about the wife who'd grown distant afterward, retreating into social circles where grief was unfashionable. "Olivia loved the idea of success," he said quietly one night. "When my health failed, the idea stopped loving me back." He didn't speak of her with anger, only fatigue. There was more, something he left unsaid, but Grace didn't press. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she'd catch him studying her face with an expression that hovered between affection and sorrow. One evening, as she adjusted the blanket over his shoulders, he reached for her hand. "You remind me of what I lost," he said. She looked at him, puzzled. "Your son." He shook his head slowly. "My conscience." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was tender, full of understanding. Grace didn't know what sins haunted him, but she could feel the weight of them. Still, In the soft glow of the fire, the old man looked peaceful, as if her presence had dulled the edges of his remorse. Outside, the snow kept falling, endless and forgiving. Inside, two lonely lives moved in quiet harmony, one finding absolution, the other learning that care could be its own kind of salvation. Something unspoken lingered between them, fragile but real, as though both sensed that this fragile peace would not last forever. The morning it happened was bright and brittle, the kind of cold that made the air shimmer. Grace was kneading dough by the stove when she heard the crunch of tires on snow, a sound that didn't belong this deep in the woods. She wiped her hands on her apron and peered through the frosted window. A black SUV gleamed in the sunlight, its chrome rims glinting like teeth. For a moment, she thought someone from town had gotten lost. Then the driver's door opened, and a woman in a fur-lined coat stepped out, heels sinking into the snow. Grace knew instantly who she was. There was a certain practiced confidence in the way the woman walked, her chin lifted, her sunglasses too dark for a winter morning. Olivia Hale didn't look like someone searching for a sick husband. She looked like someone inspecting property she'd once owned. Grace opened the door just as Olivia reached the porch. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone calm but guarded. Olivia pulled off her gloves with slow precision, revealing manicured nails the color of wine. "I'm sure you can," she said coolly. "I'm looking for Thomas Hale. I was told he's here." Before Grace could respond, Thomas's voice came weakly from the back room. "Olivia." The woman's expression flickered, shock, disbelief, then hardened into something colder. She brushed past Grace without waiting for an invitation. Inside, her heels clicked sharply against the wooden floor, a sound that felt like intrusion. She stopped when she saw him by the fire, frail but upright, wrapped in the same gray blanket Grace had given him. "Thomas," she breathed, her voice sharp with emotion that wasn't love. "You're alive." He gave a faint smile. "So it seems." Olivia looked around the small cabin, her gaze sweeping over the chipped mugs, the simple curtains, the faint scent of stew. Her lip curled. "This is where you've been. With her." Grace stood near the table, silent, her hands folded. Olivia turned on her like a blade. "You must be proud of yourself. Taking advantage of an old, sick man. Do you even know who he is?" Grace met her eyes unflinching. "I know enough." Olivia's laugh was brittle. "Of course you do. The story's always the same, lonely man. Sympathetic girl, tragic end. I hope you enjoyed playing nurse. Don't worry, dear, I'll take it from here." Thomas tried to speak, his voice strained. "Olivia, stop. She saved my life." But Olivia ignored him. "You've always been dramatic," she said, adjusting her coat. "It's time to come home." Grace turned away, unwilling to let the woman see the anger tightening her throat. She began tidying the table, her movements precise, controlled. When Olivia finally swept toward the door, she paused, her perfume lingering like smoke. "You'll regret this," she said softly, though Grace couldn't tell if she was speaking to her or to Thomas. As the SUV disappeared down the road, Thomas sank back into his chair, exhausted. Grace knelt beside him, resting a hand on his arm. "Don't waste your breath," she murmured. "Some people only understand noise." Her voice was calm, but her eyes, cold, steady, unbroken, told a different story. The next morning, the peace of the woods was shattered by the growl of an engine. Grace stepped out onto the porch and froze. Olivia's SUV was back. The woman climbed out with a deputy sheriff in tow, her lips painted into a smile too tight to be kind. "You see, officer," Olivia was saying as she approached. "I told you she was here. My husband's caretaker, and apparently a thief." Grace's stomach dropped. "Excuse me." Olivia held up a velvet jewelry pouch, its contents glinting through the open drawstring. "This was missing from my home in Boston. An heirloom bracelet, platinum with emeralds. Imagine my surprise when I recognized it in my husband's things here of all places. The deputy frowned, shifting uncomfortably. Ma'am, we just need to ask a few questions. Grace's hands were steady, though her pulse pounded in her ears. I've never seen that bracelet before. You can search the house. Olivia's gaze was ice. Oh, we will. She brushed past her, the hem of her coat sweeping the doorway like an accusation. Thomas called weakly from his chair. Olivia, stop this. Please. The search didn't take long. The deputy looked through drawers, cupboards, even under the bed. Grace stood silently beside him. There was nothing to find, only the bare simplicity of her life. When he was done, he removed his hat, his expression apologetic. Nothing here. Mrs. Hale. I'm sorry for the trouble, Miss Miller. Olivia's face hardened, a mask of outrage cracking just slightly. You'll regret this, she hissed before turning sharply toward the door. When the car disappeared down the road, Thomas closed his eyes, his breath shallow. I shouldn't have let her come. She's always needed someone to blame. Grace shook her head. It doesn't matter. But it did. The humiliation stung deeper than she'd admit. That evening, as the firelight flickered across the room, Thomas called her over. His hands trembled as he unfolded a document on the table. This, he said, sliding it toward her, is my way of saying thank you. The cabin, what's left in my private account, it's all yours now. Grace froze. Mr. Hale. I can't. You already have, he interrupted softly. You gave me more kindness than most people ever did. Let me do this while I still can. There was no argument strong enough to undo the quiet finality in his tone. She sat beside him until he drifted to sleep, the signed paper resting on the table between them. That night, a deep calm filled the cabin. The storm outside had softened into a whisper. When Grace rose before dawn to check on him, Thomas was still. The fire had burned low, his face peaceful, his hand resting lightly over his chest, as though he'd simply chosen to let go. The funeral was small. Grace arranged it herself, with the help of a few neighbors from town. No flowers, no speeches, just a pine coffin beneath a birch tree, the snow falling softly. She whispered a simple goodbye. You're home now. The wind stirred through the branches, carrying her words into the stillness, and for the first time, she felt something close to Grace. 2 weeks after the funeral, Grace heard another engine on the road, the sound she had come to dread. When she stepped outside, Olivia Hale was already at the gate, wrapped in black as if for mourning, though her expression held none of it. She looked around the cabin with open disdain. I see you've made yourself comfortable, she said, voice sharp as the winter air. Grace stood still. What do you want, Mrs. Hale? Olivia took a folded document from her purse. What's mine, she said simply. The property, the accounts, everything my husband so foolishly left in your care. You manipulated a dying man. That cabin, his money, it was never yours to take. Grace's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. Thomas made his own decisions. Olivia laughed, brittle and loud. Please, you think anyone will believe that? You, a store clerk who wandered in from nowhere, charmed an old man into rewriting his will. I've already spoken to my attorney. We'll see what the court thinks. And she did. Within days, Grace was served papers, accusations of fraud, exploitation, and undue influence. For weeks, she traveled between the courthouse in Burlington and the cabin, answering questions, signing affidavits, enduring whispers from townspeople who didn't know her story. At night, she'd sit by the fire exhausted, reading through the documents Thomas had left her. He had thought of everything, each signature, each date, each witness line filled with care. When the hearing finally came, the lawyer who had handled Thomas's affairs, a calm, gray-haired man named David Rourke, took the stand. Mr. Hale was of sound mind when he signed this addendum, he stated firmly, placing the sealed envelope before the judge. "He insisted on making provisions for Ms. Miller personally," he said, and I quote, "She gave me back my dignity when I had none left." Olivia's composure cracked then, just slightly. She rose, voice trembling with fury. "This is absurd. She took advantage of him." But the judge silenced her with a glance. The ruling was brief and decisive. The cabin and its contents were legally Grace's. Olivia left the courtroom without looking back, her heels echoing against the marble floor like an ending note. When the dust settled, Grace returned home to the quiet of the birch woods. Spring was creeping in, the snow melting into rivulets along the porch steps. With the small inheritance Thomas had left, she repaired the roof, painted the shutters, and cleared the old garden behind the house. By summer, the cabin had transformed. The windows gleamed. The air smelled of fresh lumber and wildflowers. She opened a small grocery at the edge of the road, Miller's General Store, where travelers and neighbors came for bread, sugar, and company. Some evenings, when the bell over the door rang and laughter filled the little shop, Grace would pause to listen. The house that once held only silence now breathed with life again. It was finally a home. It was a warm morning in late August when the letter arrived. The postmark read Portland, Maine, and the envelope bore the seal of the Department of Social Services. Grace nearly dropped it when she saw the return address. For a long moment, she just stood behind the counter of her small store, her hands trembling. Then she tore it open carefully, afraid the words inside might disappear if she moved too fast. "Dear Ms. Miller," it began, "we're reaching out regarding a family tracing request you filed several years ago. We believe we've located your younger brother, Noah Miller. He currently resides in Bangor, Maine, and has expressed interest in reconnecting with his sister, Grace." The paper blurred as her eyes filled with tears. She had imagined this moment for years, how it might happen, what she might say, but now that it was real, she felt weightless, almost dizzy. She closed the store early that afternoon, locked the door, and took the first bus heading north. The trip felt endless. The further she traveled, the more her heart pounded, caught between hope and fear. What if he didn't remember her? What if he was angry she hadn't come sooner? She rehearsed what she would say, but every sentence fell apart before it reached her lips. When she finally reached the address listed in the letter, a modest apartment complex lined with maple trees, her legs refused to move. Then the door opened, and a man in his mid-20s stepped out. His hair was darker, his shoulders broader, but when he smiled, she knew. "Grace," he said softly, as if testing the word. She didn't answer. She just walked forward and wrapped her arms around him, the years collapsing between them like paper. For a long time, neither spoke. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and real, under her palms. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with tears. "I thought you'd given up on me." "Never," she whispered. "I promised, remember?" He laughed, a shaky, boyish laugh that sounded so much like the child she remembered. "You still keep your promises, huh?" The next week, Noah moved to Vermont. He took a room above the store and started helping Grace with deliveries, fixing shelves, and talking to customers. The townsfolk adored him. His easy humor filled the place with warmth. On slow evenings, they'd sit by the porch with mugs of cider, trading stories about their years apart. He told her about the foster homes, the jobs, the loneliness. She told him about the cabin, about Thomas, about learning to live again. Sometimes they'd bake the old sugar bread from their childhood, just like they used to. The first time they pulled it from the oven, Noah grinned. "It still tastes awful," he said, and she laughed so hard she cried. Looking at him, Grace realized something simple and profound. After everything she'd lost, she had found her way back to family, not the one she was born into, but the one she fought to reclaim. And for the first time, the word home felt complete. Spring arrived quietly that year, melting the last of the snow from the cabin roof. The birch trees shimmered with new leaves, and the air carried the faint sweetness of thawing earth. Each morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, painting golden squares across the floorboards. Grace stood there one morning with a cup of tea in her hands, watching the birds return to the feeder she had built so long ago. They fluttered and chirped in the same spot where she once stood alone, a reminder that life, somehow, had circled back to warmth. Inside, the little store was busier than ever. Travelers stopped by on their way through the mountains, drawn by the smell of fresh bread or the sound of Noah's laughter. Grace still worked long hours, but the exhaustion she carried now was the kind that came from purpose, not survival. In the evenings, she would sit by the window, her ledger open, the lamplight soft against her face. It was during one of those quiet nights that she found herself thinking of Dr. Leonard Avery, the kind old physician who had testified for her during the case, his voice steady as he explained that Thomas had been clear-minded and grateful to the very end. Without his words, she might have lost everything. The next morning, she pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. "Dear Dr. Avery," she began, "I wanted to thank you for what you did, not only for me, but for the memory of someone we both cared about. You once told me that healing doesn't always come from medicine, that sometimes it comes from being seen, from being believed. You were right. Because of you, I was able to start over." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "I've decided to apply for a nursing program in Burlington this fall. I want to help people the way you helped us. Maybe that's the best way to honor him and the kindness that saved me." When she sealed the envelope and placed it by the door for the mailman, she felt something settle quietly inside her. The fear that had once defined her life had finally loosened its hold. That afternoon, she stepped outside. The snow had vanished, leaving patches of green grass pushing through the soil. The air was alive with sound, dripping water, bird song, the faint rustle of wind through the birch leaves. Grace stood in the sunlight, her hair catching the golden light, her eyes calm and steady. Once, she had been the girl no one wanted, lost and forgotten. Now, she was a woman standing on the threshold of a new life, rooted, hopeful, and free. The morning was soft and pale, the kind that seemed to hold its breath before the world fully woke. Grace stood in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to sing. Steam curled upward, carrying the scent of mint and lemon balm from her garden. She poured the tea into a worn ceramic cup, the same one Thomas used to favor, and carried it to the window. Outside, the snow was retreating in thin, glittering ribbons, revealing the first shy blades of grass. The birch trees dripped with meltwater, each drop catching the light before falling to the earth. She unlatched the window, and the cool air swept in, clean, sharp, alive. For a moment, all she heard was the quiet breathing of the forest. Then came a soft tap against the glass. Once, twice. Grace smiled before she even turned her head. A small bird, a red cardinal, bright as a spark, perched on the sill, pecking at the window just as it had that first winter she spent here. The sound brought the memory rushing back. The lonely girl standing by the same window, hands pressed against the cold glass, wondering if the world had forgotten her. Now the same rhythm echoed, but everything had changed. The cabin was warm. The shelves were full. Laughter sometimes drifted up from below, where Noah opened the store for the morning crowd. Grace leaned closer to the window. "Good morning," she whispered. The bird tilted its head, as if it understood, then fluttered away into the birches. She sat by the table, tea in hand, and let her eyes wander around the room. The polished wooden counters, the books stacked neatly by the wall, the framed photograph of her and Noah taken last summer. There was peace here, not the fragile kind that comes from silence, but the kind earned through storms. The fire crackled softly behind her. A faint breeze lifted the curtains. Somewhere in the distance, A church bell chimed. Grace thought of Thomas, of Dr. Avery, of all the faces that had passed through her life and left it changed. She thought of the little girl she had been, the one who had nothing but hope, and how that hope had carried her all the way to this morning. She rose and stepped outside. The air smelled of thaw and pine. The world shimmered under the first light of spring, every branch and puddle glinting with quiet grace. She closed her eyes, feeling the sun touch her face, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause around her. She had known hunger and loss, love and forgiveness. She had watched her world collapse and had built it again with her own hands. And now, standing in the golden morning, she understood the simple truth that had taken her a lifetime to learn. She had lost everything once, only to discover that kindness could rebuild a world. The wind moved gently through the birch trees, carrying her peace into the day. The circle had closed.